Hmm. Okay, I think it's working this time. I started a version of this a little bit earlier, and there was a little bit of technical trouble. At the same time, there was some noise going on. So I think we're good to go now. Hmm. So, this has to be the squeakiest chair I have ever had. So, part of what I'm grappling with here is that I have a very alive and well-formed thought. And I think this thought has a lot of value. Appropriately enough, immensely apropos, um, this thought is about self-reference. And it thinks it is important. um, there's a kind of humor there that I find beautiful, I find very important, very elegant, and it's of the mind. So my challenge, I suspect I'm going to step into what that's about, what value I'm finding there. The challenge that I'm holding here is, and especially over the last couple of days, I've had this enormous attention brought to being in a nonverbal space and to doing things that are not from thought. That's not my habit. I'll pop out of mind to talk about it and then go back into the mind's models of itself. I'm about to talk about some of the mind's models of itself, and that's a special kind of challenge for me because it's very easy for me to do from inside the mind. Remembering this in each moment is slippery. It's very slippery for me. And it's what I want to speak from here. Right now I have a kind of quality like, I'm experiencing a quality like I've been speaking about, oh, talking from my essence or talking from the eternal or letting the eternal speak. Right now it feels a lot more like I am the thing that I was talking about before. But the thing talking isn't always me. These little flickers of awareness. So that's a lot of my own focus. You know, I'm noticing actually that I don't, I have a lot of, even as I'm about to speak about this, there's this funny experience of recognizing this kind of quality in the chest. This, like, I know in this business about embedding is really important. I can highlight examples of where it's important, but it's not a tidy package yet. It's more like a very powerful intuition. Um, a bit of snark tried to come up there. It's a powerful intuition that people have been dismissing from me. Okay. I have experienced dismissal of it. Um, I'm going slowly just to make sure that I'm taking each step the way that I can see is more valuable for me. I imagine for my viewers as well. But as I mentioned at the start of all of this, um, this series isn't primarily for the viewer. One way to say it, to borrow some of the language of the person who inspired me to do this whole series in the first place, Perry Chase, it is my intention to serve the eternal that may happen to be in you. my viewer. Even just saying that, there's a settling, there's a reorientation, and I feel more clarity about how I want to start here. So, who are you? And there's this is a very special kind of question. Who are you? This is a koan. It is actually a koan that shows up in Zen. It usually gets rephrased. Who is it that awakens? This is the goal of Zen, is a kind of awakening. Who awakens? When we talk about in spirituality, there's ego death. But the way that language talks about the ego, it's almost like you've got this houseplant and the houseplant dies. And now you're sad because the houseplant died, but now there's more light in the room because the plant was blocking the light, but now it's wilted and now light's coming in or something. But on the inside, the actual experience is not that the ego dies. The experience is that you die. So if you die, who awakens after you die? Now, there's a literal question here of when your body dies and you die, what is awakening? But this gets into some really weird beliefs that complicate things around people asserting that death is just the end of consciousness, or no, you go and you reincarnate, or you go to heaven, or whatever. But we can set that aside and know, well, there's a spiritual experience that is as though you die. It is every bit as vivid as though your body dies. And then at the other side of that, you awaken. So who awakens? If you answer this by going up into thought, you will always run into a specific problem. And that problem has a very particular structure. That structure is an invitation to go down. And that's the basic thing that I want to talk about, what that structure is. Because it's not unique to this question. It shows up all over the place, over and over and over and over again. It's actually what our computers are built on. Computers are built on the technology of that sign, of that indication. But human beings have this immense capability of recognizing that sign and going into consciousness, going into the direct experiential recognition of what is true. The sense of, can I feel my tongue in my mouth? Yes. That yes is a verbalization of a truth that I know by looking. It's not a conceptual thing. Even if I have a concept, of course I can feel my tongue. Thinking the concept only matters to the extent that it's actually grounded in the lived experience. So, when I suffer, like when I am frustrated because I want some tea and I'm out of tea, this is very minor. I could pick anything. Like I'm in a situation where I really want to go see my girlfriend. We literally have not touched since Christmas 2019. Just because of the pandemic and because of international stuff. Right now she's in France. And so there's this I want to go see her. And there are complications because of the way my financial situation is. And of course the pandemic, but there are ways around that. And then whenever I take anything, like looking at the tea, I think is a very concrete example. I'm out of tea and I want tea. There's a raw experience that's just there. There's a wanting. And there is a thought. I want tea. I'm out of tea. This is a story. And as I relate to that, there is this experience of a kind of discomfort. or the discomfort is just a sensation, what is the step that turns it into not okayness? Okay? So that step, the step of, why am I always out of tea? What's wrong with me? Why can't I make the tea appear? Like, why don't I order the tea before I run out? Ugh. Right, so what's going on there? I personally don't run into that, but I used to. And I'm sure I do in other situations. There's a kind of it's got a sense of there's an intuitive ping of, wait, someone just logged on and they have a different energy than I'm used to. I'm going to set that aside. Mind can fabricate pretty much anything. So the like that, in that extra step of that, like that friction that shows up. In order to do that, I have to create a mental icon of me, like Michael. Like Michael. Okay, it's almost like I've got this like this cartoon panel, and I have to have a drawing of me in the cartoon panel so that I can think about myself. Why can't I go, like, pick up the phone and order, or like go online, really, go online and order the tea when I see that the tea is low? Well, oh, and then there's some sort of sense of, yes, I should do that. And then I need to make myself do that. And then there's kind of this invocation of pain, which I experience as, what's wrong with me? Getting that to me is one of the loudest signs that something has gone screwy. It's not the primary one, but it's an almost inevitable one. The what's wrong with me? Like that is like an emotional signal that I am disconnected from truth. Guaranteed to happen if I stay disconnected from truth. But all of this comes from this way that I'm creating a mental icon of me, and then I'm evaluating that icon, and I'm noticing the icon is doing things that do not compare well. That when I compare it to what this icon should be doing, it's not doing the right thing. And then I experience pain in association with this thought. Okay? So when I'm talking about why can't I just order tea before I run out, the I there, why can't I order the tea, is not me. It's a mental icon. Now, why is that important? Well, the mental icon is this, like, it clearly isn't me, because for one thing, I'm looking at it. I'm looking at the thought. But even as a representation of me, it is way too low fidelity. It's almost like I'm looking at a puppet, looking at a cardboard cutout. I'm looking at some sort of chunk of flesh. Now, often the details are not even that high. It's just more like I'm imagining kinds of effects in the world, and I have a me-ness associated with them. There's some kind of concept structure that is loosely a me. This is very common for how the mind works. The mind, when I say mind, I'm referring to a sort of inner computer, something that scans the world and tries to abstract and calculate, tries to achieve a goal, often by pulling things out of context, creating models of them, and then ignoring the original object and the context for the sake of the model. Most of our modern world is built on this computer basically driving the whole show. One of the properties of this computer, this is what Ian McGilchrist points to as the left hemisphere of the brain. And he does a different breakdown than the wider culture does for left and right hemisphere. It's not about topic, it's about how it does what it does rather than what it does. One of the properties of this computer is that it fragments topics. This is why universities have all of these different departments. Like the mathematics department and the psychology department and the theater department. And in a number of universities, you have some people noting, wait, what we we're splitting all these things up, but is there really that big a difference between like psychology and physics? Like it seems like you have people who have a psychology interacting with physics, and physics is a matter of how the mind works, and also the mind is subject to the laws of physics. Presumably it's connected somehow, so maybe these two should be talking more. Exactly how should that work? Well, let's create a department of interdisciplinary studies. So now we have psychology, physics, and fragmentation. Right? This fragmentation is pervasive and it's essential for how this computer works. And the computer systematically will avoid seeing it by design. It's supposed to. It's supposed to try to figure out how its models work. Its job is not to notice that the models don't work. That's the user's job. I suspect that is a lot about what spiritual awakening is about, is the user going, wait, I'm talking to a machine. It's a machine I can use, but it's not in charge. I am. Most of my own development in this space has been a matter of embodying that recognition more deeply. I have not encountered anything that gives me an overwhelming impression that that is dramatically different from the truth, aside from a weird thing about the absolute. It's all an illusion. It's all empty, which is like at that point, what are we even talking about? Exactly. And then you end up with loops and language doesn't work very well. So we'll ignore the supernal realm for a moment. So all of that comes to bear when we're looking at what is this icon? And I'm thinking I should have ordered tea sooner. I should have vacuumed earlier. I should have produced this document that I think might make me money. I should have been meditating more. The I there is not me. It is not the one looking out from behind my eyes. In some sense, it's the same version of me that I would use, like that I would have my computer, my inner computer, my mind, use in order to model what other people think about me. So there I have, oh, now I'm wishing I had a drawing of this. So imagine that I have a person who, like I'm trying to understand what do they think of me? Well, I have to imagine them, so now I have an icon of them. This is in my mind. I have a mental icon of this person. Right, so I have this thought bubble, thought bubble of the person. And then within that thought bubble, I have a thought bubble coming from them about me. So I have this icon, like their mental image of me has to be of the same type as this mental image. My mental image of them and their mental image of me are going to be of the same type. It's going to be some sort of abstraction, some sort of personness, but kind of an external, something observable. So here I am modeling how they think of me, and I can pop this out of context and look at this icon, and now I can just put this directly in a thought bubble and think of me. What I should be like. Oh, wouldn't it be great if I were rich? So add money to this mental icon. Okay. So the problem is in the advantage. The whole problem is right in the very advantage of having this oversimplification. One way to see this, and this is where it starts to get a little heady, the mind does not like following this logic. Most minds glitch as soon as I point at this, and that's the point. There's a way to train the mind so that it doesn't glitch on this anymore. And then it highlights the need for the mind to hand power back to the user, for it to ask the user for input, instead of trying to capture everything. It's imperfect. I'm still very much working on it. And at some point, the user has to step in. All the power comes from the user. But one way to see this is that here is my mental image of myself. Where is its mental image of itself? If this icon, this little figure, I'm now wishing I had a little, I even have one somewhere, a little figurine for playing on little games. Um, it's tempting to grab a ring. Actually, no, that's super appropriate. Let me grab this. There we go, a little dragon ring. So here is the icon for me. I am a dragon. Aren't I noble? Aren't I impressive? Look at all these mighty qualities I have. And from here, and then look at this and go, well, but where is its image of itself? I can make it a little more refined by imagining like it has a little thought bubble, and then in its little thought bubble, there's a little figurine of itself, a little mini dragon ring. But now I've just iterated the problem. Right? Because this little dragon ring here doesn't have a thought bubble of itself. And then even if it does, then that one doesn't have a thought bubble of itself. So you actually end up with infinite recursion. You end up with this infinite regress of, wait, this doesn't represent me because it doesn't represent the fact that I am representing myself. What does it look like if how would I correct that? I can't actually imagine infinite recursion. I can do something of, and it goes on. I can say the word infinity, but my mind is not capable of computing an infinity. So how do I fix this? Right? So there absolutely is a very clean way of fixing it, of adjusting it so that my thoughts about myself are in fact about me. But it involves this principle that's like the proper name for this is self-reference. Initially, it looks a lot like recursion, but it's the computer has a really, in fact, all computers. This is a property of how computers work. They all have a lot of problems with self-reference. Some are finding ways to get around it, but there's a tendency for most systems to have most systems built on the model of the left hemisphere of the brain, like computers, to have real problems with self-reference. So in lived experience, the way the resolution to that particular paradox looks, okay, well, how do I think about myself at all then? Well, one answer is, approximately speaking, you don't. You almost never think of yourself. You think of icons, and then you worry about the icons. This is a lot of what the Buddha was talking about in terms of there is no, there's a special term for this. It's slipping my mind exactly. He didn't say there's no self. He said that there is no, I don't quite remember the phrase, what the translation was. Separately abiding. There is no separately abiding self. Of all of being. That doesn't make any sense. But how do you see that? Well, as long as you think there is something you need to do, then the second you in that there's something you need to do in order to understand it, that you is an icon. It's a mental image of yourself, but you've already separated out the you. Like there are two different yous being played out in that statement. There's the user and the mental icon. So the getting the mind to understand this is actually really helpful because it highlights this question. It brings us right back to this question that I started with. Who are you? The mind cannot hold an icon hold an icon that stably references you. My mind cannot hold an icon that stably references me. The closest it can get is with self-reference. I am the one asking the question, who am I? So then the question becomes the answer. Who am I? Exactly. Right? If you felt something there, like I still feel this little in my mind, this little what? Who am I? Right. There's this sort of feeling like, wait, but what was the answer? To which the reply is exactly. Now, this is one of the most wicked examples of self-reference. This is very slippery. Be capable of casting an illusion of being a separate self navigating this physical world requires this particular application of self-reference to be really hard to track. Self-reference appears all over the place. This is the so what would be an easy example? Self-reference is hard. It is cognitively challenging in that you have to get your mind to go through the steps and recognize, oh, no, this is actually complete. There's a completeness here. It is done. One example is in the puzzle of how do we know, like this is a critique that I've given several times in this series. How do we know that scientific reductionist materialism is correct? Or is, even if we want to be particularly pedantic about it, saying, well, we can't say correct, but at least it's an adequate model for what it is that we are trying to do, blah, 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 blah. Like we can get funky with the language. I'm not trying to play word games here. I'm just looking at, oh, wait, when we talk about things like there's a dismissal of something called the hard problem of consciousness, which is this, this deep puzzle of, if physics is correctly describing the universe, then how does consciousness come about? I mean, this doesn't highlight the hardness of the hard problem of consciousness, but the issue is, if you have, you imagine it's atoms bumping around. It's actually much deeper and weirder than that. But if you just have atoms bumping around, the atoms aren't conscious, and the atoms combining together aren't conscious. And you put all of these different bits of matter together, and then some of that matter responds in mechanical ways to different frequencies of electromagnetic radiation. And then it shifts and turns and does all kinds of different stuff. But somehow we end up with this configuration where a certain kind of electromagnetic radiation hitting a particular part of our bodies, which is to say when light hits our retina, there's a translation that happens somehow, but where we can even follow the mechanics of the optical nerve sending a signal to the visual cortex, and visual cortex doing some kind of processing. We don't know all the details. But the problem is, at some point, maybe it's not an abrupt point, but somehow that gives rise to the experience of color, for instance. Where does the experience of color come from? You could see having a machine create some kind of noise like, I am seeing green, but where would the subjective experience of greenness come from? Like the utterance in order to communicate, that part makes sense, but where does the subjective experience come from? How does that arise? That's the hard problem of consciousness. The basic issue in physics is that at a very, very foundational level, the answer is it can't. There isn't a place for it to happen. But we have all of this evidence of physics being right. So how do we deal with that? And one answer is, oh, well, clearly we're just going to resolve this at some point. We don't know how, but clearly consciousness comes from the brain. How do we know? Well, if you remove the brain, you remove consciousness. If you apply electromagnetic radiation to the brain, the person can go unconscious. You can modify conscious structures by modifying things in the brain. So clearly, consciousness is somehow arising from something that the brain is doing. But this is where there's a kind of loopiness that happens. It's very important to when we're trying to explore what it means for something to be true, not just as a philosophical question, but when we're looking at something like here we are in this world where there's a whole lot of question about what is actually really going on, what is true, how do we orient to all the chaos that's happening in this world. All of our information institutions are showing loud signs of distortion of various kinds. And it doesn't matter which info channel you turn to, all of them have some version of corruption. Every single one of them. This was always true, but it's become extremely loud now. We're in a global information war. So orienting to that and going, well, how do I determine what is true? How do I anchor in reality? If the basis of reality is a kind of authority where scientists and the scientific establishment gets to establish what physical reality is, but they can't answer something like, well, how is it that you're able to experience the results of your own experiments? There's a problem. There's an outsourcing of where am I getting my sense of truth from? And that itself doesn't address the core question. So there are two ways to see where the self-reference appears in the reductionist materialist paradigm. And this is not to say that this paradigm is wrong, it's to say that the people who espouse that it is obviously correct and anything that doesn't fit this paradigm is obviously incorrect, because this is really what's real at the basement. Like, people who are saying this don't know what real means when they're speaking. They do know what real means on a different level, but what is talking is the computer, the left hemisphere. What's talking is not the sense of truth. There are two ways to see what's going on with the materialist thing. One is, how do you know about the results of your own experiments? Now, the computer has a really hard time tracking the implication of that question. There's a tendency to answer it with words and concepts. Well, we did this study, and here are the details of how the study works, and like we examine these things, and the math works out, and here's the details. And how else would you explain this? Now, this is very solid research. Like when we apply this electromagnetic radiation to the brain, it creates these kinds of effects. Okay, great. I'm not denying that within that framework you have observed these things. My question is, how do the observations happen such that you can validate the framework? If you use the framework in order to answer that question, you're not answering the question. This is sort of like saying, well, how do you know that you can trust the Bible? And the answer being, well, because the Bible said so. Like, that doesn't say the Bible's wrong, but it is worth noticing that what was just said is, well, the Bible, by my read, is self-consistent. I'm not that much of a biblical scholar. I don't actually have an opinion about it. I'm just highlighting the logic is identical. Highlighting a material experiment done in order to determine properties of consciousness that speak to how you're able to observe the experiment is an example of one of these loops. It's a self-reference loop. Anytime you end up with a self-reference loop, what you are observing is an invitation to notice the way in which the framework you are working within, the framework that is offering these assertions, itself is pointing out its own limitations. This is a kicker. This comes straight out of, this is a bit of meta-mathematics. There's something called Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which says that, I'm butchering things, and in order to make it a little bit more intuitive. But the essence of it is, whenever you have a system that is um, that is complicated enough to literally count, like it's able to have counting numbers in it. Anytime you have a system that is complicated enough to do that, and certainly physics is, then there is a place within that framework where, and the proof shows you how to find it. Like there's a place within that framework where you can demonstrate that either that framework cannot show that something that is true is in fact true, or it can show that something that is false is true. It's called Gödel's incompleteness theorem because it suggests that any system that is not inconsistent is incomplete. Now, you don't need to know the logic of this, but the point is to highlight that there's actually a mathematical theorem that says that when you have these self-reference loops in a system as complicated as the paradigm upon which modern physics is built, you are guaranteed to find a place where it is inadequate for describing its own topic. Now, that doesn't mean that it's wrong about things like how do you build lasers. That doesn't mean it's useless for these things. It doesn't mean that it isn't a valuable pursuit. It is to say that the physics framework can never capture reality. No framework can. Okay. So that's one way to see it. Another way to see it goes straight through the mathematics, which is to ask, so where is math? Is math part of the physical world? Is it somehow beyond the physical world and is governing it? This is a puzzle that again, the computer has a really hard time with. When, like if I have if I have a model of how cups work, right? Like how does this cup work? Well, it works because it is sealed against liquid, pour liquid into it, and then it's able to hold it. Okay. Well, the thing is that in order for me to ascertain whether my model of the cup, whether my thoughts about the cup are accurate, I have to be able to see my model of the cup and see the cup and compare the two, which means there have to be three perspectives. There are three positions. There needs to be a cup, a model, and a me. Okay. But you can't do that with all of reality. My model of all of reality is this. Oh, okay. Well, that means that this is in reality, so there's your self-reference. Also, so are you. You're in this reality you're talking about. So there's actually a couple of points of self-reference within the model, which means your model, by Gödel's incompleteness theorem, has already demonstrated itself to be inadequate for what you're talking about. And the way that in practice most people deal with this in a lot of technical domains, because it works for most cases. Like the self-reference is not a huge issue for things like how do you build a train. It doesn't matter. Trains you can treat as objects that are external to you. It's straightforward. It's very hard when you're trying to build a civilization that is kind, because kindness is part of an internal lived experience and part of the nature of existence. We can't do this model and build a kind society. It's not possible. We can use the framework, but if we believe that this framework is the truth, we're going to keep running into the same problem over and over again. So in practice, to do things like building trains, what like engineers and scientists, mathematicians do is they treat mathematics like it is a perspective that is outside of that which it is modeling. Then it's straightforward. I have my mathematical model of the train, and then there's the train here, and then we'll build the two and we'll make sure they match up. And according to mathematics, this should work. Let's run some tests. Okay, great, that runs. Let's hit go. Okay, great, the train works. Ah, wait, it's squeaking there. Oh, right, because like reality's complicated and we need to put some WD-40 here. Okay, whatever. That's very straightforward. But when you try to do that to all of reality, what you end up doing is you have math being treated as outside of reality so that you can model reality with your math. And then who are you? Well, we won't ask that question. We're already presupposing a kind of divine perspective from beyond both reality and math that is able to look at both and see that the math matches what you observe in reality. But if you're doing that, that means that what you are calling reality is not everything. Guaranteed, it means that there's a lot being filtered out. So one way to see where there's a gap is, well, where is the math from? Why does gravity follow these mathematical laws? Why does electromagnetism follow these mathematical laws? What creates that? Are we in a mathematical universe all the way down? So there's actually no matter and it's all math? Okay, great. So now you are saying that the map is the territory, and there's your self-reference, and now Gödel has something to say about your vision of truth. Okay? So this matters on one level, on a philosophical level. It matters for tracking a lot of the lived intuitions that a lot of us have for where meaning comes from. One of the reasons that I have been exploring a bunch of Hermetic philosophy, which is going into the Hermetic Kabbalah and things relating to the history and use of tarot and things with astrology and things with alchemy. One of the reasons I've been looking into these is because this is one of the pockets of meaning making that the West inherited. It is one of our predominant meaning making methods. It actually saturates our culture. It is why, like that whole arc is why there are 7 days in the week, and why there are 24 hours in a day. All this comes from this historical context, and the order of the days of the week, the reason we name them how we do, actually comes directly from some details about astrology and the interplay between the fact that there were 24-hour days defined by the cycle of the planets and a specific order of the planets that were observable in the sky in terms of how quickly they moved against the background stars. It's a little complicated. But once you see it, it's extremely, extremely clear. It explains why we have Sunday and then Monday and then Tuesday and then Wednesday, and why it's consistent across basically the entire westernized world. Because otherwise, why 7? 7 is a terrible number to make for the length of your week. 7 isn't divisible by anything. It's a prime number. It's god-awful. Why would you divide your time that way? The only advantage is that it is almost 1/4 of a moon cycle. Almost. But then we don't even use a lunar calendar, despite having months. Means that just create random stuff. Anyway, all of this has a bunch of mini side rants here about how history interplayed with this. But the reason I explore these things is because they are, when properly understood, I think that they're highlighting dramatically different ways of living in reality to see it from a very different perspective. That is highlighting something meaningful. Now, I don't think they're right, because I don't think right makes any sense in that kind of context. The same way I don't think right makes sense when you're talking about physics. Being able to see that, being able to pull from what is valuable, what works, and what do you mean by works, is part of something like the mature job of the inner computer. As long as the computer is grabbing onto a very specific framework, it's going to keep making the me mistake. What's wrong with me? Right? There's that glitch, that inability to recognize the self-reference is immensely practical. It's immensely practical. It shows up as when I'm interacting with a lot of the people who are really involved in a lot of this more magical or esoteric stuff. There will often be this kind of fervent, oh, if I have to, like there's like I've read this book about like how quantum mechanics has shown that consciousness creates our reality, and I totally believe in this thing. And there's a sense of, well, you're wrong. Just fact. I don't mean to pop your bubble, but I mean, if you care about truth, then you're violating truth in saying that. But don't mean to violate your meaning making. And the fact that you have to choose between truth and meaning making is an interesting problem. Right? The idea that a physics experiment could disprove your meaning making method. Like this is part of a very complex heritage the West has created. It's created in a desperate effort to make sense of the world in a way that doesn't make sense, in a way that's very fragmented, it's very shattered. So these self-references show up because that inner computer, the mind, cannot model itself. It can have better and better models of itself, but it cannot fully model itself. That's not its job. That's not within its capacity. Just like computers cannot have perfect models of themselves. Even if a computer has a model inside of it that is of the computer, like you go to your operating system and the operating system tells you how all the hardware is doing and tells you how the software is running. One thing it can't do is show you the software checking on how the software is doing, checking on how the software is doing, checking on how the software is doing. That's some of that same infinite recursion. It can't actually do that. It can't do that literal movement because it will run out of processor speed, or out of memory. In practice, it'll run out of memory. And at some point, it'll just have to cut the simulation, which means that all of its, there's an inaccuracy in its self-modeling. The next best thing is to have some loop of self-reference. But logic is really, really bad at self-reference. It has real problems with this. There's an entire domain of logic that is devoted to, like the logic of provability has a lot of things having to do with self-reference, and it is one of the most head-twisty things people work on in the domain of logic, as far as I know. This is where you end up with things like, how do you make sense of a statement like, this statement is false? Well, if it's false, that means the statement's true. If the statement's true, then what it says is that the statement's false. So is it false or is it true? The usual answer in logic is to say that's stupid, let's ignore it. Let's say it doesn't count as a statement. Let's banish it from consideration. That's the answer. And I think that's the right move if you care about building trains. It's not so much the right move when you're trying to deal with trauma. And so in trauma, you actually run into these kinds of loops. Like there's some sort of challenge I would run into with my partner where when I was feeling a kind of insecure about our connection and wanting some kind of reassurance, the act of me feeling that way would trigger in her a sense of being imposed upon, of being extracted from, and she would withdraw, and she would be incapable of caring for or holding space for my experience, which would stimulate my anxiety about, hey, wait, but if I have to be totally okay and not have any problems with our relationship in order for our relationship to be okay, then what do I do when I feel insecure, when insecurity comes up? And the answer that comes back is, I'm sorry, I can't be available for this. You've got to deal with it on your own. Okay? So in that, what do I do? Now, I've answered this one. I'm not actually looking for an answer here. This is not I'm not welcoming anybody who's watching this to jump in and give me therapy on this one. I'm highlighting how this has the same structure. It's a structure between two people, but there's an issue here that has very much the "this statement is false" kind of nature to it. Or it's actually a little bit more like "this statement is true." If you train your mind to be capable of navigating self-reference, you'll start to notice that there are flavors of self-reference. And the flavor of "this statement is false" has a buzzing, oscillating nature, whereas "this statement is true" has a two things are true at the same time in a stable way. If the statement is true, then that's what the statement says, and it's stably true. If the statement is false, then, well, it says it's true, which is false, so that checks out. So both truth values work stably throughout time, whereas the "this statement is false" has a kind of oscillating nature to it. There's a lot of flavors of self-reference like that show up all over the place. So "this statement is true" highlights something like the upward and downward spirals. Not exactly, but it's something like the upward and downward spirals of, hey, when I lean into trust in our relationship, this creates opening, and the opening encourages trust in the relationship, and there's this reciprocal opening that's happening. But if I get scared and contracted, and any of that energy goes into the relationship, then that creates a scary scenario for me, which contracts me even more, which feeds the contraction, and then we have mutual closing instead of mutual opening. So how does one navigate this? And the actual answer, every time, whenever we run into these self-reference loops, the answer is that self-reference is a sign that the mind is encountering a place that is outside the mind's domain. Maybe a different framework can come in that will change it so it's no longer self-reference. But a different framework has to come in. It has to be a dramatically different experience of reality. Right? That's the large-scale abstract sense of it. But the lived experience is, if I'm encountering self-reference, then that's a signal. Like I said at the beginning, it is a signal for me to drop into the direct experience of what is here. So who am I? If I try to answer that question, I produce an icon. And then I run into a problem of trying to get that icon to think about itself. How does that work? If I am at all accurate about me, then it has to be thinking about itself and asking the question, who am I? But how does that work? As soon as I see that loop, as soon as I see that recognition of the icon having to think about itself, not think about a copy of itself, but think about itself directly, as soon as I see that, that is a signal that I have gone into the mind in a domain that is not the mind's domain, and that if I pursue this direction, I will be confused. So who am I? That's it. What do I do when there is this reciprocal closing and I want to fix it, but I can't, and my partner and I are getting into a buzz? Drop the frame. Step back. How do we solve the hard problem of consciousness? Where does consciousness come from? Each one of these questions gets answered by the act of going into the experience, by going down into experience instead of up into the mind. Often you answer them by recognizing you have gone up into the mind and you've got to go down into experience. Recognizing that, basically having a signpost in the mind that says, oh, this is a koan. It has nothing to do with understanding, not in the mental way. It is understanding in the direct perception sense. I understand that I can feel my tongue in my mouth. It is a direct knowing. It is the ground of truth. when I try to model that knowing in my mind, in that inner computer, then I have self-reference. How do I know I can feel my tongue in my mouth? Because I feel my tongue in my mouth. But what sense does that make? Oh, well, that's trying to answer the question with the mind. That's not what the mind is for. Recognizing that, seeing every strange loop, is borrowing a term from Douglas Hofstadter. He has this book, I Am a Strange Loop, which, by the way, when I've skimmed through this, I haven't actually read the book, but when I've skimmed through it, he's a little sloppy with his examples. He sometimes gives infinite recursion as an example of self-reference. They're importantly different. Although infinite recursion, the need for infinite recursion is a sign of self-reference being the move that's needed in order to make sense of what's happening. And just give one other quick example, because this one sometimes makes it click for people. If you and I are having a conversation, and I pause and I say, hey, you know, the way that this conversation is going, there's kind of I'm finding myself feeling a little itchy in my chest, and like there's a level at which we could be a little more honest or something. I'm wanting to see if we can speak to that. So at that point, when I make a move like that, I'm popping meta. I'm talking about our conversation. So I'm inviting us to have a conversation about our conversation. So the conversation that I'm now inviting us to have refers to if you respond with something that goes, you know, the way you just did that, had me feeling really awkward, and I want to, and I'm hoping that you could not do that kind of move, where you're interrupting the conversation in order to talk about how the conversation's going. Like that's feeling very awkward to me. So at that point, there's a base conversation we were having. I provided a meta comment. It's about that. And then you provided a meta comment that's about that. So now we're 2 meta levels up. Now in principle, we could go back and forth. We could talk at one particular meta level, or we could go meta above it. And there's no end to the amount of meta that we can go. We could have a conversation about the conversation about the conversation about the conversation about the conversation we're having. It gets really heady to track all of that, and when I've had conversations like this, almost always with people who have a lot of programming experience. We have to diagram our conversation in order to track what we were talking about. Okay? So that's one kind of direction. But there's a different sort of conversation that is possible, which is if we had a chat about conversations in general. And then I started saying, so for instance, in how we're talking about this conversation about conversations in general, you notice how there's kind of this natural rhythm that we sort of intuitively know. This is when I speak, now this is when you speak. And being out of sync with that intuitive knowing, that sort of kairos, that natural timing, creates a feeling of awkwardness or frustration depending on how things happen. Now, when I've done that, even though I'm commenting on the conversation by kind of going meta, in going meta, I've landed back in the same conversation. Okay? That's another example of self-reference. And we never talk about that. We don't have that meta conversation, that self-referential conversation, for the most part, because in practice, part of us already knows the purpose of language and conversation is not conversation, it's something else. We don't usually have to talk about that. Okay, so it's kind of a silly example because that's a chat that we basically never have. Some people might have it, like I could imagine linguists having that kind of chat, but I wouldn't stay in the self-reference for the most part. So these kinds of self-reference loops actually happen all the time. Anytime you actually take a worldview, an impression of truth, and you stretch it out far enough, you will find a place where there is a self-reference loop. Most of the time, most models don't get extended that much. Most models literally cannot count, by which I mean they can't go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so because of that, they skirt around Gödel's incompleteness theorem by being too simple. Just taking a general rule of, oh, if I experience a strange loop, that's an invitation for me to look at reality as it is. Getting good at that cuts through a lot of noise, a lot of pain, a lot of confusion. And it requires practice. It requires intentionally trying to think through the self-reference loops. It's not something minds like doing. By default, they avoid doing it because it helps to keep the illusion of a complete simulation. If this clicks for you, if you decide what I'm pointing at here is worthwhile, one implication that will start to rev is that you have no idea what's real. That's correct. No one does. No one has any idea what this is. And it is absolutely freeing and wonderful to deeply recognize that. I know that I found it kind of terrifying when it was first connecting. Like, if I can't understand it, how do I orient to it at all? I'm still working on that one. But I'm a lot more calm about it than I used to be. If you've gotten to this part, gotten this far, an hour into me talking about self-reference, which is easily the most cognitively challenging topic I teach. I used to teach university level mathematics. And this is easily the most difficult, the most cognitively difficult. If you've gotten this far, bravo. Thank you for listening.